So now that we have an actual database, let's write the code necessary to connect our application to that database. And that's all we'll accomplish this time around, is just to connect and make sure that our connection actually works. And it's pretty straightforward to do that. Now, the first thing we need to do, of course, is to install the necessary driver for Postgres. And there are a couple to choose from, and there's a lot of contention about which one to use. So, to be honest, it wouldn't matter which one I picked. I'd have some people saying you should have used the other one, and some people saying you should use the one that we're going to use. So, at least half of you will be happy. So I'm going to use a really standard one that's been around for a long time. So open your terminal window, and we'll go get -u, and we're going to get github.com/lib/pq, and to specify the actual version, just to make sure that everyone is working with the same version, we'll go with v1.10.0. Okay, so go get that, and we'll go get it and add it to our Go mod file and install it, and now it's available to us. So I'll close my terminal window, and I'm looking at main.go, and I'm going to add a few imports up here. So after, or right before flag, I'll put in context, which is built into the standard library, and that's something we'll be using momentarily. I'm also going to install, or import, database/SQL, because we're connecting to a SQL database. And at the very bottom, I'm going to put a blank line here, and then type in the blank identifier, the underscore, and then github.com/lib/pq. Okay. So it's showing some errors right now because we're not using context or database SQL, but we'll be doing that shortly. So let's scroll down a bit, and let's go to our config variable, where we're defining our config. And what I'm going to put in here is one more thing. We'll put in the db, which is a struct, and we'll be modifying this before too long. And that only has one field right now, or one member, dsn string. And that's our connection string. That's what we're going to use to connect to our database. So down a little bit further, we need to get that connection string. And yours will be different than mine, but it'll be really easy to follow what I'm doing. Now at the moment, and this is a short-term solution, I'm going to read the connection string from a command flag when we start up. And I'm going to put a default connection string that will allow me to run the application without specifying any command flags. So we'll use a flag, and we're going to get a string var. And we're going to call this, or write it into, cfg db.dsn, which we just added to the type. Okay? And we give it its flag name, which we'll just call it dsn. And then we'll give it a default value. Now this is where yours will be different than mine. I'm going to type Postgres, and so should you, // then whatever username you use to connect to your database. So mine's my initials, and if you have a password, you would go : whatever your password is. But mine is set up so that I don't have to use a password, okay? Then @ and your host, in our case it's localhost because our database is on the development machine, / whatever you named your database, mine's called Go Movies, and then a question mark, just to be safe. You might not need this, but it's not going to hurt it. SSL mode equals disable, just to tell the connector that we're not using SSL to connect to this database. And the last thing is the Postgres connection string. Okay, so that will get the DSN into our configuration. All right, let's go a little bit further. Right to the bottom of the file, we're going to add a new function at the bottom of the file. And I'm going to call this function just OpenDB. And it will take one parameter, CFG, and it's of type config, and it will return two possible things. A pointer to SQLDB, which will be a connection pool, all of our connections we're going to use to connect to the database, and potentially an error. So first thing we'll do is open a connection to the database, and you do that as follows. DB is one return value, check for an error, there assign the value of SQL.open, and specify what connector you're using. Ours is Postgres, and that tells the connector which database driver to use, and then the DSN. In our case, that's just cfg.db.dsn. And check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then we'll just say return nil, because we don't have any connections, and our error. Otherwise, let's go a little bit further. Here's where we're going to use the context. CTX will be the variable we're creating. Cancel is used to cancel a context, and we'll go to context, which is a built-in package right from the standard library, with timeout. And we're getting that from the context that is always available, which is context.background. And we give it a reasonable timeout, say 5 times time.second. Like that. And then we defer cancel. Okay, now we try to ping our database. So we can use the error variable we just created a little while ago. We don't have to reinitialize it. And we'll say db ping with context. And hand it the context we just created. We'll check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then return nil and error, just as before. Otherwise, return our connection pool and no error. Okay, so that's the function we're going to call. Now let's go back up here in our main function, just after the logger line. And what we'll do in here is call that function we just created. db and error are assigned the value of OpenDB and hand it the config. Check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, I actually want to die at this point because if I can't connect to the database, nothing's going to work. So we'll say logger.fatal and write the error. Okay? And then, as you always have to do, once you open a connection pool, you need to defer closing it, db.close. Okay, so the last thing we'll have to fix is down here on line 68 in my code where I call serve, listen, and serve. That can't be an assignment operator because we've already declared an error variable back on line 47. This just becomes equal. Now, if all went well, I should be able to open my terminal and run this application. And just one thing to note, Postgres must be running or we won't be able to connect. So let's run. Go run cmd/api/star.go on a Mac or Linux. And of course, it's go run /command/api/dot on Windows. So let's run it and see if we get everything right. And I have connected. Perfect. So we have successfully connected to the database. And now it's possible to go on and to begin reading information from the tables in that database and serving actual content. And we'll get started on that in the next lecture.